debriefing some recent tech news is going on and also kind of waxing poetically around some things that I want to get Lakshay's take on. So, hopping right in, Lakshay, when we started Scholar AI, roughly call it 3 years ago, we were kind of, I think, correctly categorized as a GPT wrapper, right? We were kind of
Hmm.
building things that bridge the gap between what users ultimately needed and what the vanilla or the baseline large language models were capable of. That has evolved since the time, call it 3 years ago, when those wrappers were kind of looked upon as kind of, let's call it, cheap middleware, and
Right.
phased in our ever increasingly important harnesses.
Hmm.
I personally have had the experience where running a single model, so call it, Opus 4.7 as an example, via the API, via Claude Code, and via Claude Cowork, all give me reasonably different results, sometimes better, sometimes worse. But what is seemingly apparent to me is the harness that these models are kind of wrapped in, right? Whether that be, again, just kind of, bulk API, whether it be Claude Code, would it be Claude Cowork, seems to be material for the actual performance of the underlying large language model. So, kind of kicking it to you, have you had this experience? If so, why do you think this might be? This is kind of being recapitulated by all the folks that I can talk to. So, again, just as someone who's building with this day to day, curious to get your take on that. Are you experiencing the same things? Why do you think that might be?
Like overall commentary being like the harness is still a model dependency. The harness is not like a thing that gets to escape
It,
the.
it matters, right? Meaning,
Yeah.
meaning like people that are interacting with Opus 4.5 in the chat interface have relatively subpar powers
Right.
to the super powered model that runs in the Claude Code
Right.
interface, as an example.
Yeah, I mean, it's just this. I mean, like the GPT wrapper and the harness conversation, like it still is to me. I mean, we see this happen all the time. That like Claude will release like legal tooling, they'll release financial tooling that like does it actually end up wiping out startups? Not necessarily all the time. What ends up being a real issue in is go to market of those companies. And if the go to market of those companies ends up being worse than just Claude for finance, Claude for legal, they end up losing anyway. Do people end up caring about like how much the harness is actually capable of doing? Is kind of hard to judge, especially since kind of people end up baking their own behavior into the Claude code usage or the Claude cowork usage. Um, but to that end, I think I kind of look at it as like every model has this like we kind of allude to this in some of our internal chats. Like there is a set of kind of like probabilistic numbers about this model might behave in this certain way. Like maybe this model is really, really good at like lane recovery, right? Maybe it's really, really good at returning to an idea that might have been lost in the thread or kind of jumping out to explore but returning to the core idea. That is a feature of some models, right? Some models might be really, really good at going like really deep into a subject and staying very, very focused. In some cases, that's a pro. In some cases, that's a con. Um, and I think to that end, understanding the value of harness, quote unquote, I think is just like some of the work being done by the developer to understand those nuances on behalf of the user without them having to do that traversal themselves. How immune is that? I think is basically a question of like between all these different models of those sort of like latent properties and like the latent like feature space of like here's how this model generally behaves. um some of them will continue to be rapid increases. We see that in just like code where the things covered by code just continue to get better and better. um but coding is not necessarily the typical way to treat all problems. So there's some value in a harness that like the developer has done the work to understand like, hey, like how far can the model jump away from a subject and return to it? That might be really valuable in science, but maybe not so much for legal, for example.
Yeah, I think the way that it has been described that really resonated with me the best is you can view these models, like the large language models specifically, as mice running in a maze,
Mm,
and the harness is the maze, including the prompts, right? So like the
mhm.
harness kind of presets some of the borders of the maze, and effectively the large language model just kind of gets to progress, run into walls, redirect, steer around, that kind of thing. And the harness kind of acts again functionally as the maze in which it kind of
Yeah.
can navigate into. But it is, I think, extending this to the broader point. I don't know if you're experiencing this as well, but I'm experiencing almost a dichotomy of opinions on AI and its emergent capabilities among my peer group and the folks that I can interact with most often, between folks who are using chat interfaces, sometimes on the free plan, sometimes on just like the basic, $20 per month plans, and those
Mhm.
like us that are using
Yes.
max plans, Cloud Code, that kind of thing. And again, I just think this illustrates this kind of harness idea where folks that are using maybe even the same model, but almost in a form factor that doesn't give it its full superpowers, have a very different perception of what these models can do than the folks that are really kind of building at the extremes of these things.
I mean, even just like I mean, if you look at the average like GPT user, like I doubt the average person even knows that they can like give custom instructions to the model, and that in and of itself is gigantic, right? Insofar as like every time I run a system, if all the context it has on me is that like the memory systems have automatically collected, like we've seen posts about this where people will talk about ChatGPT having like, oh, I asked it for like a pancake recipe once, and now I'm talking about like a trip to Berlin or something, and for whatever reason it injects information talking about pancake options in Berlin, even though it's completely irrelevant. It just so happens that the kind of auto memory manager decided pancakes were really important to this person, and it infects every chat, right? um, but insofar as what ends up happening to the quote unquote best harnesses is that like it's not like you or I, like when we're talking about like, I can imagine like both you and I might do like, hey, like analyze this like financial spreadsheet, you know? And the financial spreadsheet system will have space for us to custom prompt, custom plug in, bring in tools specific just to that work that are designed very specifically to solve that problem set. Maybe it won't go perfectly, but even when we see it go awry, we can tell the system how to self improve to deal with that problem in perpetuity, right? Um, Whereas someone doing the same thing in GPT again has a risk of just like generic system prompt left subject to memory aggregation. We'll have like, hey, like here's your financial analysis spreadsheet. Here's what it could do for like making pancake buying opportunities in your company, which is just silly. Um, I do think, I mean, like on the question of like how valuable is the harness versus the GPT, I do think it ultimately does come down to like, I think that is still fundamentally a go to market question for most companies, that even if you describe like we are building the best agent harness for finance, you're just still subject to trying to beat the forward deployed engineers who are working at Anthropic, working with the financial firms, where the harness is still pretty easy to copy. And even if on like benchmarks, you beat Anthropic's like forward deployed engineers building generic financial tools versus custom financial tooling for a firm, you're still subject to, is this convincingly better than anyone else is? That still to me feels like a strategically not a good thing to lean on, I think, if you're a nascent company.
Yeah, I don't know. To be clear on I think, current brainstorm, it's not so much with respect to if I were building a company, would I focus on the harness layer,
Mhm.
if you want to call it that. It's just that it's becoming increasingly obvious to me. I think that layer matters. Now, I think who
Okay.
builds the layer, and again, does Harvey survive because they have the best law harness? I don't know. What I'm saying, I'm not
Right.
really speculating on that. What I am speculating on, it does seem like even amongst the research labs themselves, as an example, I have a typical workflow in which if I want to draft a new document, I'll start in Cowork and say,
Yeah.
hey, here's a material. Please help me draft this document, yada, yada. I might go through one or two iterations in Cowork, meaning that first draft's not quite right. Here's actually the kind of narrative lean that I'm, aiming for, et cetera, et
Yeah.
cetera. The downstream of that, once I have the document kind of, call it like 70% done, or so to speak,
Mhm.
I will then go to Microsoft Word or Google Docs, depending on, where I kind of want this thing to end up. And I will launch Claude in Microsoft Word
Yeah.
such that I can interact specifically with that document rather than having to do like a whole file rewrite and those kind of things. It's like even amongst
Interesting.
myself, those are basically two different harnesses, right, for the exact
Right.
same model on the exact same document. But I am finding
Right.
myself leaving one ecosystem to the next because it's slightly more convenient than continuing to iterate
Mm.
in a single co-work chat or thread,
Right.
whatever you call it.
That's interesting. I think in like the most idealized scenarios that like these systems would eventually kind of self-learn, like, hey, Damon's a user of our models. The harness would kind of self-improve for like, oh, we learned that Damon like likes writing documents this way, has this narrative lean for this category of document. And even like at some point, like hopefully it kind of skips end to end on like, hey, you want this word draft, you can still edit it in real time. Like the information, even that the quote unquote harness bubbles up to you, is sufficient enough to replace your UI usage of Word, right? Um, I think that's kind of like half the problem, that like the just the memory and the personalization systems underlying these harnesses are still like very greenfield, right? They're not an established thing, that like learning your patterns and tastes is not something that these models are good at. Thus, anyone, even like us using a thing, like will tend to reprompt for the same style of corrections or the same like, for example, my equivalent is like if I'm like drafting like infrastructure code, right? Like I have a very specific way that I like my infrastructure code like written into storage or saved or like even just interacted with. But by default, Claude will always just like, oh, I'll just AWS CLI to spin up your like instance, whereas I'd prefer something like more stateful. But it's not kind of its like native behavior to recognize like, oh, Lakshya likes spinning up infrastructure via Terraform or something, you know. And that's obviously very, very niche, but it's broadly applicable to the whole space. Um, that feels kind of underserved. I know a lot of people are working on, but still, again, there's no consensus or even like a, I think even like a frontier lab opinionation on what the correct thing to do there is.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Mm.
Switching gears slightly, but in similar theme of this and building new startups around this ecosystem and that kind of thing.
Mhm.
I don't know if you saw this, and even if you did, just stating it for the audience that may not have seen it already. OpenAI has recently come out and announced they're investing
Yes.
$2 million worth of token credits basically into new YC startups starting in, I think, the
Yeah.
summer batch. So, for those that don't know, YC runs 4 batches per year. They coincide seasonally with the 4 seasons of kind of of the U.S. and
Mhm.
not the world, but you know what I'm saying, of the U.S. and the Western Hemisphere, so to speak. And so anyway, just immediate thoughts, immediate comments, reactions to OpenAI essentially investing, for a portion of every single YC company that wants it on the magnitude of $2 million worth of credits.
To me, it's like a pipeline for like forward deployed engineering to acquihire kind of thing. Where if you have a YC startup that's kind of unlocked in industry and like can run the enterprise cycles of agents on some sort of predictable cadence, like they have a scale pattern, they have a growing pattern. Um, it makes a lot of sense that you give these companies tokens. So one, they do all that work with your models. And two, if they're really successful, one, it's financial outcome for OpenAI because they have a stake. And two, it's obviously like acquisition opportunity of like hopefully a pretty talented team that lives in the OpenAI ecosystem that's able to push enterprise deal flow into what it would be OpenAI's future eventually, maybe. Um, it's smart. It makes sense to me. I mean, it's the same way that, like, I mean, as you know, like YC demo days are barely even an investment opportunity. All the deal flow is done before the demo day even happens. Um, it's just an opportunity to like kind of like ride along. Where I'm sure a lot of these companies now would love to have like YC as their first stamp of approval, OpenAI backed as their second stamp of approval. And it's just overall like a good business handshake, effectively, for what a lot of those companies are doing, given how much B2B agentic workflow stuff exists.
Yeah, I find this strategically advantageous for all folks involved on a
Mhm.
number of different vectors. So just like itemizing them, number one, it's a win for Y Combinator because now all of a sudden you get this unique differentiator so that
Yeah.
startups that go through your accelerator now have access to basically $2 million in additional investment, right? Just for
Mhm.
simply being accepted. Um, for the founders, it's an obvious win because it may be the only investment in the history of the world that actually gets better over time,
Mhm.
meaning like in effect, the cost of compute decreases, right?
Yeah.
So that $2 million is probably worth slightly more than $2 million if you like have some sort of variable cost depreciation
You
or
got like
whatever it
talking
is.
coast as like a math equation under as a
Exactly.
denominator. Yeah.
Exactly. And so, again, for those two cohorts, it's obviously advantageous for those reasons. And then number three, for OpenAI, it's advantageous because they get exposure to startup companies that can themselves increase in value. As you alluded to, they get a firsthand look
Mhm.
at who are the most talented folks building on top of our API. They probably capture some form of provider lock-in, meaning like folks that
Yep.
start on OpenAI will be more resistant to switch off of OpenAI, so they get this revenue stream, and then
Mhm.
they kind of get to see if they were going to pick off verticalized opportunities themselves, which ones might be the most attractive. right?
Right.
And so this is a continuation of the playbook that OpenAI has run for a while. But to me, again, it feels smart, and it feels smart in a way that is kind of win-win-win for all
Yeah.
parties involved.
Yeah, it's to me like the like categorically, I mean, you look at like what YC is, and it's such like a brand credibility stamp. That's just the sort of thing that like I think when you look at YC founders, like it is ultimately like a branding game. So many of them end up as like duds that make a splash on launch but don't really go anywhere. But being able to say like we're first YC, now we're OpenAI backed. I'm sure a lot of these companies, especially those that are doing like highly regulatory or need to impress really big brands, that saying like y'all don't really care who YC is, but you probably care who OpenAI is, and OpenAI is like a partner of ours.
Hmm. Hmm.
Lends a lot of credibility that the cycle of sales almost gets a lot better simply by having that logo on your page. Um, Whereas, like, I mean, the startup circle is like, I don't know how much like weight being able to say like, oh, we're like YC backed, A16Z backed, Coastal backed, like can push someone over the edge. Whereas right now, all the conversation that people are aware of in AI is like OpenAI, Anthropic, having one of those two logos on your page probably makes a warm lead like super, super easy relative to just only talking about your venture backing. So yeah, I agree. It's just kind of like strategically a win for all parties involved. Like it just makes a lot of objective sense why this would be a thing. Um, and I don't think any founder would really mind having one of their early investors be a frontier lab ever. You know?
Yeah, I do wonder if some of the psychology driving this is because you can get to revenue much faster and with much less spend than traditional software businesses. I wonder if YC is kind of just using this as an additional incentive for folks to apply to their
Mhm.
accelerator. Like we've seen continued success, batch per batch, in kind of the revenue numbers and kind of traction, if you want to call it that, that the companies inside of YC are making. So I do
Mhm.
wonder if they're just kind of seeing that and seeing maybe at some point companies don't need YC as much because they're able to generate a lot of
Mhm.
this revenue on their own. It's hard to know how much traction is a direct downstream consequence of being in YC versus what would have been realized independent of being at YC. Do you know what I'm saying?
Right.
So venture is competitive, and again, I think this is really smart for YC to say like, come to YC. Not only do you get all of the original benefits of YC, the name brand, the recognition, the stamp of approval letter, saying now you also get this kind of direct access to OpenAI. Because I also have to imagine, and we went through this at Scholar, mostly you, um, is you probably get direct BAAs and stuff,
Yeah.
right? With these groups, meaning like you can probably front run a lot of the bureaucratic red tape that would
Yeah.
otherwise be harder to access if you weren't in direct partnership with the OpenAI right now.
Yeah. It's the same thing. Like the OpenAI investors are like incentivized to see you succeed. So
Mhm.
like I think your movement through an AI frontier lab provider ecosystem as a buyer is probably a lot easier. I don't know, I just kind of look at YC as like, I mean, we even see it's just like the average age demographic of YC is dropping by so much.
Mhm.
Like the average median age and everything is like a college age range, maybe even younger. Um, that I just kind of look at as like the overall state of youth and like early career, especially in just like the tech space. In the best case, like the 1%, like top percentile students, in the same way that we talk about, like, oh, you got to get to an Ivy League, go to Stanford. And the benefits of Stanford are like the brand name, like the people you can meet, like the network you can gather. I think that general same principle is being extended to the incubator world. Like, I think A16Z is trying to do the same capture after seeing how successful the YC playbook is, about being a well marketed engine for talent effectively. If you capture that talent early, then you can kind of shoot them along their way to sort of snowball in the capital ecosystem rather than it being like the alternative, which is like go to Stanford, MIT, go get a FANG job and climb that corporate ladder. It's instead you're climbing like the Silicon Valley like status ladder with like expedition if you start at YC. Um, which is again, it's objectively it's just wise for everyone involved. It just makes a lot of sense. I don't know how true the thesis generally is of like YC is obviously hyper beneficial to a lot of like early founders. I don't know whether like the average business person would quote unquote find like that same sort of momentous. I guess you kind of assume that you're going down the VC path the moment you get into YC, naturally, right? But in that world, there's a lot of, I think, discussion to have about if you're like a well-established founder or someone who has like a business background or something like that, like how truly necessary is YC versus like how much of it is a brand stamp, especially given like the equity is fixed, the investment value is fixed. That I don't know that OpenAI would like in the longer term. That point you made about them seeing revenue just increasing going up and not knowing how necessary YC is in the longer term. I'm curious as to what their position would be on like discovery or venture opportunity outside of the incubator space. Because again, we talk about this all the time. I imagine solo entrepreneurship just becomes a more common thing. Well, a lot of those companies like just scrapped up by like non-technical people or whatever it may be, reach the level of acclaim that they would without YC hypothetically. Kind of hard to judge just because YC is a marketing engine for the startups that they're invested in. But there is something to say to kind of have like your sales pipeline warmed up by the orange Y, which is the value fundamentally.
Yep. Yeah, it's worth restating. Startups in the earliest days are a game of collecting resources, and this is another resource
Mhm.
that's made available, right? It's just one. I mean, and so you can go about it as a solo founder. You can go about it as bootstrap co-founders. You can do it through many ways, and AI is enabling different paths. But
Yeah,
inevitably, it boils down to how can you acquire resources. AI is a mechanism to do that. YC is a mechanism to do that,
yeah,
and this new OpenAI investment is another mechanism to do that. It just so happens that the two now come as a package deal in one case.
yeah, yeah. I mean, Shashi once said this earlier, like maybe like even a year ago, but the idea of like when you're valuing your company or when you're trying to like get like exit your company, like it is ultimately a matter of like how much does your company weigh at
Mm.
the end, and like assets collected, even if it's just purely branding, saying like you go into a VC conversation or like even like a private equity conversation for acquisition. I imagine the valuation you get saying we're OpenAI backed is a lot higher than if you didn't say that, just by virtue of that what that company is. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
it's,
it's
it's
just
worth
interesting. Go
it's,
ahead.
it's worth mentioning for folks that may be first time listeners, maybe new to kind of this venture ecosystem. What you also do by having OpenAI invest in you is you align the incentives of all of the OpenAI investors. Because if you do well, OpenAI does well. If OpenAI does well, they do well, and that can be a powerful flywheel, right? If you
Yeah,
have if you have the right people working on your behalf and incentivized to see you succeeding, that does kind of tend to success begets success in this case,
yeah,
and that tends to be a pretty powerful mechanism. Again, kind of want to pivot off of this to another thing that is uh, interesting and kind of topical today and yesterday. So I'm seeing more and more reports for Waymo specifically
hmm,
as they roll out in like the Atlanta area. I don't actually know if
okay,
they're like operational in Atlanta proper or if it's the actual Atlanta, like area,
yeah,
suburbs and those kind of things. I'm unsure, but I am seeing repeated kind of issues with
yeah,
that rollout. So I've seen
yeah,
like the hilarious like traffic cones. I've also seen some reports where they had cars driving into floods
yeah.
somewhat unexpectedly.
Do you
And
see the horror movie just like circle around the
yes,
cul-de-sac?
yes,
Yeah,
yes, yeah. So it's these kind of things. And again, I guess I'm just setting the stage, not necessarily delivering an opinion here, but just kind of asking, what do you think? To me, this very much just kind of breathes like as you expand these automated technologies, you find edge cases in new
yeah,
locations that weren't present. And the one's about
yeah.
curious. You're in San Francisco. You obviously Waymo's a part of kind of your day to day if you choose it to be. I'm in Durham. We don't have Waymo's here. I'm curious how this lands with you.
I mean, so some category of the issues that they're talking about in Atlanta, I think there's this it's almost like a cold start problem. Like I don't know if people culturally are like adopting Waymos as quickly as they do in SF. SF is just such a tech forward city that everyone's just riding one when they can. What that means is that Waymos generally aren't idle, right? Like they're not spending time spinning circles around the city waiting for someone to use them. But ultimately, there in any given city, there's like limited spaces that are quote unquote unoccupied in a very literal physical sense. Um, and so as I understand a number of these issues is that like because you don't have rapid adoption of the tech experience to that common public is actually worse because the cars have to idle somewhere algorithmically. I think because they're only ever testing in Austin or SF where adoption is kind of implicitly higher off the rip. You don't really you get exposure to the problem of, hey, how do we get these things idling in a way that is one, not all one hive mind swarming one section of the city, um, and two, like where do we stow cars fundamentally in a city that doesn't have the same parking systems or there's inconsistent parking systems. The water one was surprising to me. It's hard for me to come up with like a tech or even like a cultural explanation for like why that wouldn't have been understood. I mean, it's not like San Francisco is lacking in rain or heavy water situations. But it's the sort of thing that I just kind of assume like same with any AI ML issue. Like data exposure is ultimately what teaches your things to get better. Um, I think between like the idling cars, like not having places to go, like maybe limited consumer adoption or slower consumer adoption than other cities get to experience, you just end up with more cars visibly making the same sets of issues. And that especially gets loud in media when you can see like basically like a beehive of these cars, like all stuck in the same flood or all like looping the same cul-de-sac and cutting everyone off. So the kind of narrative that results from lower consumer adoption is explicitly kind of doomed to be worse than it is in like a city in SF, or maybe like if that were to happen, it probably would have been just like one car and one bad intersection reported by some friendly tech futurist to whichever, governance group lives at Waymo taken care of. Um, but even in San Francisco, we saw during that period where like there was a big blackout, like a bunch of Waymos all got stuck at the same intersection. And that was popularized because it was one set of data that forced a hive of these cars in a way that was media friendly to kind of interrogate at like a publicity level. That Atlanta, I think, is just experiencing in kind of mass right now because there's just all sorts of new issues plus the exacerbated lower consumer adoption.
The lower consumer adoption point is not one that had crystallized in my brain. Like I hadn't really thought on it. I mean, it's obvious when you're saying it out loud, but I hadn't really thought
Yeah.
about it. But it is interesting because the algorithm's two parts, right? The algorithm first off has to put cars close enough to people such that when they summon them, the wait time
Yeah.
isn't extreme, meaning they have
Yeah.
to kind of, like as you're saying, circulate so that they can kind of be at all of the reasonable nodes where
Yeah.
people will be kind of like calling them from. But again, I bet that algorithm is overfit in new locations
Yeah.
when they start. So I bet that is what's driving that like hive, behavior where it's like, oh, we have to be in these areas because this is where, people are summoning Waymos. But
Yeah.
they probably over-index on those early signals where it's like, oh, this cul-de-sac specifically called
Yeah.
3 yesterday. They might need 30, today
Yeah.
or whatever. And this like kind
Yeah.
of hilarious. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's the sort of thing that like if you think about like in Austin or in San Francisco for that matter, I don't think Waymo as a company would have ever had to have thought about like having a parking garage for their car. Like it makes a lot of sense that you just basically like send the car out for the day, make sure there's a charging location that someone can attend to for maybe 30 minutes per car. I mean, they come back to their kind of like home base, which I mean, you see I know where like Cruises is. I don't know where Waymo's is, but the Cruise just ends up like going into like this underground garage under the office and they just maintain the cars on their own. Right. But Atlanta, like it makes a lot of sense. I mean, some of the most interesting like folks I've met who are trying to do like deep tech stuff. One of their theses is basically like, if we're gonna have autonomous cars everywhere, we need like autonomous parking garages that do the maintenance, that do the charging, that can do like the sort of ops and be like a data center for all these vehicles, that they can't just keep up taking idle streets. Like what, for example, if I'm in a more spread out, like horizontal city, like in LA, right? The streets are so crowded, the traffic is so generally intense. The cars need to be idled in a way that like spreads out across the city very, very well. But what that also means that like the cars per square meter is probably a lot higher than the average city, while the amount of square foot like meters in the city itself is really, really large. Where do you keep all those cars? Where do they charge? Where do they come back to? Is probably like a very, very difficult problem for a city like LA that I imagine that whenever it rolls out to LA beyond Atlanta, you end up with all sorts of new issues, which are like, for example, a car might lose charge or something because its algorithm was better fit for a smaller, less traffic congested city, and that just like shuts down the middle of the highway with someone needing to tow it. That could
Mhm.
happen because just on the data exposure.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, the, going to parking specifically, we've looked at a number of ideas, that solve the parking for humans
Mhm.
specifically. I personally am curious if that's a technology that gets leapfrogged. Meaning, if I were building a
Mm.
parking solution, I don't know that I would be solving the human problem of parking, because
Right.
that to me feels like ephemeral, right? I guess we can debate timeline. Is it 2 years, 5 years, 50 years? I'm not
Right.
sure, but like I just it feels inevitable to me that self-driving cars are the future. And
Right.
in a world like you said with self-driving cars, what you need is self-sustained maintenance. You
Hmm.
know what I'm saying? What self-maintaining places,
Right.
because the cars themselves can't do it. Like you're not going to strap a robot that cleans the car to the car. I don't think. I think what you're going to
Right.
have is like a smart parking spot that does all of your kind of standard maintenance stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of assume it. And I mean, just riffing off the idea very specifically, like I assume the value that actually ends up happening there in the long term, if you're solving for quote unquote humans, the value to derive there is actually the like parking spots are very, very city to city in regards to how they're implemented or how they're made available. And I think if you're the layer that captures like the government contract to build parking space monitoring or whatever for people, whenever full autonomy or like a more highly concentrated autonomous population emerges, like what your value is that you are the base layer that most of these systems build their APIs or like calls and webhooks off of, because you hopefully have captured like in Portland, there's one company called Parking Kitty that basically manages like all of like how you pay for parking. And any company that wants to do parking solutions for like, oh, like parking sucks. Here's how we're going to solve it for people. Kind of assumes that you need to do a deal with Parking Kitty first because they're the layer that's managing that already. And if you come along and you say, I'm doing some sort of like edge compute for parking, all of a sudden, maybe it's only for humans now, but that API is what your Waymo car servers and everything will end up calling anyway.
Yeah, there's some really optimistic projects that are looking at how they can repurpose parking around major cities
Mm.
as well, in a world in which you don't have that many parked cars. Meaning, like if you
Hmm.
have Waymos online rather than parking while we're eating at a restaurant, right? They're just
Hmm.
going and serving other drivers, right? They're just taking
Right.
road trips, that kind of thing. And so, what do you do with that city space that currently is reserved for parking garages or parking lots, and how do you make it green space more enjoyable, those kind of things. So
Right.
yeah, it's a really it's interesting. It's interesting. I think it's a little bit too early to really
Yeah.
know what's going to shape up there, but it is yeah, it is interesting nevertheless.
Yeah. I guess. Should wrap there for the day. Call it.
Yeah, sounds great.
Cool.
Thanks
All
everybody
right.
for joining, and catch you all next time.
All right. Thanks, y'all. Bye.